Hello everybody. Today we are going to speak about Rabindranath Tagore's vision of education. He was born, as you know, in 1861. He passed away in 1941. In my series on key texts, I have always emphasized the historical period within which the author of the text wrote. If you look at the dates, 1861 to 1941, what will strike you is that he passed away almost 6 years before India became independent. So his story, his experience, his writings are all based in a colonial India. This context is extremely important to understand Tagore and his writings. Tagore, we all know that name. We know that he wrote the national anthem of India, that he wrote the national anthem of what is today Bangladesh. We know him as a great poet. Many of us know that he got the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1913, that he was an excellent painter, that he was an essayist. What we probably don't know as much, that he had very fine ideas on education. His ideas on education is not very well known. In contemporary times, where much of the information comes from social media, comes from WhatsApp, in fact, we have lost the ability or the awareness to realize that when we write or when we put down the ideas of any scholar, considerable amount of research has to go on into that person's writings. For example, just now I had mentioned that we all know about him being a Nobel laureate. We all know that he was a great poet, but we do not know that he wrote so extensively on education, that he had a theory of education, and that he tried to experiment with that theory of education in what is called the Vishwa Bharati or Shantiniketan, in Shantiniketan as it exists today. Why is it that we do not know about him in such major fashion? The reason is very often that people did not have easy access to his writings. Tagore's educational writings are vast, but most are scattered in independent essays, speeches, and letters. Some are only available in pages of old magazines and periodicals or lying in obscurity unknown. It is through the effort of scholars and researchers familiar with Bengali as a language as well as English that efforts have been made to collect these writings, put them in some coherent structure. I emphasize this point particularly in the contemporary context where we are governed or dominated by buzzwords, one-liners, two-liners, where people will send you good morning WhatsApp messages with some good quotes or some one-liners. Very often those quotes, if you check, are not even the original quotes. Since we are doing an effort towards understanding key texts, I would encourage you to very often, the next time you get a WhatsApp message with a quote of a great thinker or a scholar or a sage, please check. Did it actually take place? Can I have access to the original writings and find out that was that true or not? So this challenge of availing of the actual essence and content of a person's writing has become much more difficult in the contemporary period, which is governed by what I often call over-communicative abundance. Too much information all around, spreading 24/7 around our lives. This inability to access many of the educational writings of Tagore has deterred many educational researchers. Further, as I just mentioned, a majority of Tagore's educational writings were in Bengali and not translated into other languages. So the issue of access to writings therefore become extremely important. To popularize is important, but to popularize with reference to the actual since the actual logic, content, and to be rigorous to the actual content of an author becomes particularly important today, because very often people are misquoted. I would also like to touch upon another point, a point I had already mentioned when I began this lecture, when I referred to the fact, why do I emphasize years? Why do I emphasize date? It is important that Tagore was born in colonial India. It is important that many of his experience was a response to what was happening in colonial Indian society. Many of his experiences on education were related to the nature of educational practice during this period. Here, I bring your attention again to the issue of texts and context. Text and context has been a constant theme in our entire series on key texts, as well as on the series on sociological writings. Social contexts bear upon an author in an obvious manner that their texts respond to both the issues of their times and the extant debates of the same. What do I mean? There are two aspects to how context shape texts. Say, for example, if I have to write about the world today, I will be referring to the major issues which are bothering us at this juncture of time. It could be the question of unemployment, it could be various challenges to education, it could be attacks on women, it could be the growing assertion of women, issues which we see around us. That is, the issues which are living issues in society. But that's not the only way context impinge upon text. The manner in which I articulate it or express it, I also locate it in the existing debates which may be there at this point of time. For example, there is a debate about violence against women and rapes, and whether the rapist should be given punishment by death. And there's a lot of debate that this may not actually deter, and the efforts should be differently. So I will be responding not only to the pressing issue of violence against women, but I will also be looking at the existing debates on that issue and expressing my views thereof. Tagore likewise was responding to the issues which were pressing then: poverty, great inequality, education which seemed dull and bereft of any kind of life, disconnected to everyday life, to people's life, people's livelihood, and the forced imposition of a foreign language to people for whom this seemed unfamiliar as a mode of expression. These were issues which were very central to him. Likewise, this was not only the only context which was impinging on him. He was familiar with the debates which were taking place both within the country, within the national movement, within social reformers, as well as Western debates or debates elsewhere globally. In fact, this has been a defining feature of modern Indian thinkers. We are eternally grateful to these modern Indian thinkers, to the nationalist freedom fighters, who were very aware that yes, we must be grounded, we must have our feet firmly planted on this soil, but we must be exposed, as Gandhi had mentioned, to the winds from different parts of the world. So this richness of the local and the global and the national makes its presence felt on Tagore. One view, there are various scholars who try and look at this whole question of context and text, and one view holds that authors cannot break out of socially given structures. So what they can say hinges on the structures to which the communities give them access. A good example is that right through the colonial period, the issue of a nationalism or the idea of a nationalist movement or an anti-imperial movement were the given structures, not just physical or political structures or cultural structures, but cognitive structures through which we could express ourselves. So that is the other way. So some people feel that we are in a certain sense completely structured by the historical context within which we live. We can only speak in the language which we have learnt. Others have argued, yes, we can speak only to a large extent in the languages which we speak, but we can also imagine another world. We can imagine another language. So, for example, in literature, we very often have the idea of utopias, the idea of imagining a world which is completely different. Some of you who have heard my lecture on Sultana's Dream by Ruqayya, you would recall that she is talking in a society where a lot of women had to live perforce in parda. But she was imagining a world, ladyland, where there were only women, and which was therefore a critique of existing society. So this debate about context and text are extremely important for you to understand. So again, the next time you see a particular message coming on your smart telephone, look at it carefully, say where has it come from, is it authentic, is it not, can I go back and check a quote in the original to find out the validity of this particular quotation. Now, we must therefore be constantly aware of this dynamic and dialectical relationship of context and text as we look at Tagore's engagement with education. Now, let's emphasize and let us explore and describe the context within which Tagore wrote. In order to understand the educational theory of Tagore, it is essential to refer to the history of then education system of India. Prior to the coming in of the British, we had various kinds of educational systems in India, but they were usually traditional educational systems, and it was an extremely unequal educational system. In a traditional society, it was legitimate to be unequal. Therefore, only a certain section of society belonging to particular castes and communities would have access to knowledge, would have the privilege to study texts. Secondly, many of these texts would be theological. So you studied, the idea of education therefore was essentially theological, or maybe if you want to use the word religious. You were being trained in a particular way. For the large majority of a person, this educational world, this knowledge of the larger past or larger future or the larger universe was something people never got to know. So they grew and lived and perpetuated the livelihood of whatever their father or mother did. So a potter's son or a potter's daughter would be a potter or married to a potter. Likewise, a leather worker, and likewise maybe somebody who was a mason, or maybe a goldsmith, maybe a peasant, maybe an agricultural laborer. It was only those who were more privileged, had access to certain kind of social resources, who had the privilege to benefit from education. So the two contexts which impinged upon Tagore was the East India Company and the British government. The East India Company and later the British government were interested in introducing Western education primarily as a means of training a sufficient number of Indians in English to make the task of administration easier. Notice here, therefore, education was in order to train people to run administration. It was felt that it was not enough to rule India only by the British rulers. They needed some sort of support from what the British would call the natives. Therefore, the focus was on higher education. They ignored and neglected secondary and elementary education and emphasized higher education. It became subservient to higher education. This imbalance continues in the contemporary context. People even today, you go to the same universities, but you come from completely different kinds of primary and secondary education, which trains you very unevenly to the challenges posed by higher education. State universities, which was the dominant form of universities in our country till very recently, were the only places where people would go for higher education, irrespective of the fact whether you were privileged or whether you were not privileged. Now, you would have heard of Macaulay's minutes. And Macaulay wrote very extensively, and he wrote, "We do not present an aim to give education directly to the lower classes of the people of this country. We aim, that is, we are not wanting education for the lower classes. We are raising up an educated class who will hereafter, we hope, have the ability or the means of diffusing among their countrymen some portions of the knowledge we have imparted to them." That is, Macaulay was trying to say that we must at present do our best to form a class who may be interpreters between us, that is the British, and the millions whom we govern, a class of persons who would be, and note this, Indian in blood and colour, but English in taste, in opinion, in morals and in intellect. So the purpose of colonial education was primarily education to create a certain middle class who would enter administration, who would help the British to rule the rest, who they explicitly said they were not interested in educated. So you had a very, very strong class component to Macaulay's Minutes, apart from a racial component here, because they said that we wanted Indians who would be Indian in color and blood, but would think like English people, would identify with the English, and would rule the rest of the Indians as English people would do. What happened? What happened and what was the outcome and the fruits of this policy? An Indian government report in 1918 describes the fruit of this earlier policy. From the economic point of view, India has been handicapped by the want of professional and technical instruction. Later critics would argue that Macaulay basically wanted to have a body of Indian clerks trained for clerical duties, mechanical duties. You would recall we had done Weber's bureaucracy, and if you go back and look at what bureaucracy meant and the dispensation and knowledge of certain procedural rules and their functioning, it was not for exposing people to the liberal arts, to the idea of humanities, to the idea of beauty, to the idea of the noble views and goals of philosophers across time and space in different parts of the world. So the Indian government, that is even the colonial government, had already realized the limits of that education. The colleges are turning out numbers. You can identify with what's happening today. Large numbers of people getting out of colleges. Our colleges turn out numbers of young men qualified for governmental clerkship, while the real interests of the country require, for example, doctors and engineers in excess of the existing supply. That it is not enough to only train Indians to be administrators and clerks, aids and assistants of colonial rule. We also need other kinds of skills, for example, of doctors and engineers. What happened, therefore? There was a decay of the public spirit. So it was not just that we didn't produce enough professionally competent people, but we also failed in producing a kind of education which created a sense of citizenship and social efficiency in the student. If you look at the history of liberal education, you would see in modern education there was a clear link between that education and cultivating the qualities of citizenship, that you had to be trained, so to say, in the constitutional values of a society, into the ideas. For example, in independent India, we have a constitution which valorizes equality, liberty, fraternity. All of you are familiar with the preamble of the Constitution. Now, education is not just supposed to train you with certain skills in order to become clerks during the British period, or to become doctors and engineers, important as they are, or to become IT professionals or management professionals, as is the cult today. We also need a culture of living with people, citizenship, solidarity with other people who are your country, men and women. And we need social proficiency and efficiency in the student. The exclusive development of the intelligence and the neglect of the emotion has stimulated the self-regarding instincts and has largely destroyed the feelings of social and national responsibility and of sacrifice for the common weal which characterize the good citizen as distinguished from the good man. Here, this quote is not to Tagore, this is quote to Annie Besant, who was also living at that period of time. You'd be familiar with her, that she was not Indian by birth, but identified entirely with the Indian national movement. And what she is saying here are 2 points which is evident even in Tagore. The idea is that the entire emphasis on skill and intelligence has neglected the idea of emotions. What today, in today's language, which we would call EQ. You've all heard of the intelligence quotient, IQ, and people now say the IQ is not enough, you need EQ. So you have very successful people who may take their life, who may not know how to face failures, and the whole critique is that education is not teaching you to cope with the challenges that you may confront in life. So the emphasis on emotions, we shall see in a later lecture, is very evident in Tagore too, that this, and I repeat the quote, the exclusive development of the intelligence and the neglect of the emotions has overstimulated the self-regarding instincts and has largely destroyed the feelings of social and national responsibility and of sacrifice, the common weal which characterize the good citizen as distinguished from the good man. This is very, very important. If I can sort of quickly go back and emphasize some of the key points which I have articulated so far. One is that we have to always locate a text or a thinker in the historical context within which they lived. It's very important to understand what were the issues that confronted society in which they lived, and it is also very important to understand the debates, the public discourse, the discussions which were being played out at that period of time in order to understand why was this writer writing what she or he was writing. The context and the text relationship. The second point that I emphasized is that the context impinges in 2 different ways. One, it impinges on with the kind of social issues that people address. Second, it impinges in the language, articulation, and even ideological orientations with which they may concur or disagree, because those currents are also socially given. Now, when we come to Tagore, we realize, therefore, that his location, I've already referred to his dates of birth and death, the colonial context was extremely central. Now, the British colonial rulers was establishing an education which was catering not to the people at large, not education as a right of every citizen. In fact, all of us Indians were not citizens in a colonized state. We didn't have the right of a free and independent citizen. What the British colonial state was doing was creating a kind of education which would be instrumental for colonial rule. In this context, Lord Macaulay was extremely important, and many of you would have read about Macaulay's minutes in their history books. And the entire argument, if you go back, the quote was that we want to create Indians in color and by blood, but who think like the British, who would think about the interests of the British. There, in a certain sense, it's also a very, very unfortunate development, a legacy of the colonial period, where the people who were educated did not identify with those who were uneducated. It was almost that there was a national divide between the people at the top and the people at the back. We already inherited a society which was unequal through various kinds of caste, tribe, and racial, gender differences, but this was compounded by a modern educational system. Now, Tagore was therefore responding to this and saying that, look, we have to have an education which would allow people to communicate with other people, to live with other people, to be in communion, not enough to be a good person, but also a good citizen. Citizen, because when you say a citizen, it means that every person, every individual in that society is equal. So the idea of equality, the idea of fraternity, the idea of freedom, the idea of liberty became extremely, extremely important. The other point which both Besant and Tagore emphasized was the whole question of the fact that the emphasis was too much on the intellectual, not so much on the emotional. And it became important to what we often call holistic education. Holistic education means an education which did not neglect any dimension of human life. You looked at all aspects: intellectual, skill, emotive. You also looked at human beings' relationship with nature. Very interestingly, Tagore's experiment in Shantiniketan was that you looked at rural reconstruction. You looked at music, you looked at art, you looked at painting. You had idea of classrooms under trees, the idea of the nature connect, the nature social connect, which has been a challenge for modern societies. It is in this context that you will have to look at Tagore, place Tagore, and see how you would try and see if Tagore is relevant in the contemporary period or not. Are his ideas of education relevant today, when children are so pressurized in school that when they sort of train and plan for the board exam, it's a crisis, not just for the child, it's a crisis for the family. Parents take leave. There are, lines of helplines set up, counseling, agencies set up in order to see that the child is not pressurized in any way. It is important, therefore, to look at some of these old texts and see that if these texts are relevant in this contemporary context. It is in this light that I encourage you, to look back at Tagore. Fortunately for us, many of their originals are online in the internet. Do have a look. Do not get tempted by any simple lines about Tagore. Thank you, and we hope in another lecture to continue this discussion. Thank you.